Good afternoon to you on this Friendship Friday, last Friday in June. My name is Mark Long, rector of the parish of St Andrew in Newlands, Cape Town. In the funeral this morning, we read Psalm 23, and I was particularly struck by verses 1 and 2 and verse 4. Verses 1 and 2 go and I'm sure you know the psalm well, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." And as I read those words this morning, I was just struck by how much I miss those green pastures and the still waters. That there's something about lockdown that just has removed that sense of peace, underlying sense of peace from my life. I'm not sure that I necessarily experienced it all the time prior to lockdown, but been very aware with all the change that lockdown has brought about, that the pandemic and this virus have caused, that I live with a certain amount of anxiety in terms of both the present and the future, fears of perhaps picking up the virus, particularly passing it on to others. And then, of course, everything that goes with the change in the way we live and the way we relate. It's just brought so much change, and I long for those green pastures. I long to be able to just lie down beside those still waters and just bask in the warm sun. It may be a while before that happens, but I'm also becoming aware that actually this is a new context, and I need to rediscover ways to experience that gift of God, those green pastures, those still waters. Verse 4, of course, stood out particularly because it was a funeral this morning, but also because life has changed dramatically. And so the words in verse 4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And just aware that with all the change, this time of lockdown has been a valley in the shadow of death. Reality as the virus kicks in and people actually die due to it. But also just having lost a way of life, and one that one knows one cannot return to. And perhaps excitingly, that we can begin as societies, both kind of locally and more globally, perhaps even begin to live differently and more caringly. But nonetheless, it has been a valley of death. And of course, those words, "I will fear no evil," are important there. Because it's about trusting that God is present in the midst of all of this, that God is still with us, that God still walks beside us. What struck me, though, as well, was the importance of finding definition to life in this new world. So much of lockdown, even though it's eased up now, has meant that many of the old boundaries that defined how we lived have fallen away, or otherwise have become extremely permeable, and work and personal and everything else is a lot more interwoven than it ever was before. And so I started looking back and was reminded of something a training rector of mine said back when I was training at the cathedral in Pretoria, that I should look at the day as three parts: morning, afternoon, and evening. And his advice was never to work more than two parts of the day. Now, I don't always get that right, and often find I have a busy morning followed by perhaps a planned quiet afternoon that fills up, and of course, probably meetings or Bible studies or other things in the evening. And so it's quite easy just to work the full three parts of the day. And when I find myself exhausted, I'm reminded by Alan's words and attempt at least to bring my life back into some sort of balance. Not working mornings often is quite difficult if I know I've got a busy afternoon and a busy evening, because one's aware the office is open and people are in and out, and somehow to be sitting back relaxing when others are working, I've never found particularly easy. Perhaps that's been the gift of lockdown, that I'm aware my secretary is working all sorts of different parts of the day as well, and I don't have to be overly aware on that sort of level. But I think we are kind of brought up that you wake up in the morning and you get on with the day. But often and certainly under lockdown, things have been operating differently, and we're required to be available and around at different times of the day. And so that wonderful gift, it has a sort of Benedictine kind of flow to it, that one does consciously set aside time for different activities, work being an activity, recreation and exercise another form of activity, relationship building another one. And so how and my question as much to myself as to you is how are we doing in terms of actually putting aside specific time for those kinds of activities? Then in the last week or so, I've also participated in the Recovery Summit, some wonderful talks just reflecting on moving forward and what life, how we need to perhaps grapple with life and what the future may be. And one talk was by Jim Hagemann Snabe. He spoke about leading through crisis towards renewal. And he mentioned, in terms of dealing with change, that actually, while there's a ton of it out there, we need to prioritize. And he suggested, interestingly, prioritizing 3 areas and then committing a third of one's time to each of them. And that was partly what sparked my memory of the 3 parts of the day. But I just found that quite helpful, and working at trying to figure out how to interact that in my life. But to actually just explore what are the 3 big areas of change that are needing to happen, and that may be personal, it may be ministry-wise, it may be life-wise, and then ensuring that there's some balance in terms of time focus on each of them, and in building those forward. And just playing with the ideas for me as well, looking at my ministry life and what are my 3 priorities in terms of ministry, and ensuring that I give each of them sufficient time, reflecting perhaps more on my personal life and need, and what are my priorities in terms of exercise and relationship, and perhaps just identifying 3 that I build conscious focus on. And it just, for me, was helpful. And I mention it because actually reflecting on that brings me back into a sense of these green pastures that Psalm 23 speaks of these still waters. That when there is some form of order, even if it's not perfect order in any way, it may still be quite chaotic, but at least there is a little bit of structure on which I can hang the different parts of my life. And while life will always continue just to happen, it's helpful to have a few handholds and things that are there to remind me and to be more focused on particulars. And so I share that. It's something that you may or may not find useful, but I think it's part of the gift that Psalm 23 speaks of, that God is there, that God's desire is that we should know a deep level of peace in our lives. And in this new context, we need to be very conscious about actually putting structures in place that will enable us to experience the gift that God gives. And so may we know that gift of peace, that gift that touches on our anxieties, our fears, our uncertainties, and that we may begin to feel a little bit more centered in a changing situation around us, and in a situation that will never quite be what it was before, and going forward may even be different on a daily basis. But God is here, God is with us, and we are called to those green pastures, to those still waters.